Just off the coast of Newfoundland sits a little piece of France. Not a spot with some old French history, but actual France. The people there are French citizens, they pay in euros, and the plugs in the wall are European. It's called Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, and it's the very last scrap of what was once a giant French empire that covered half of North America. France handed over all of Canada, but not these two foggy little rocks. And about 5,500 people still call them home today. The question is why? Why hang on to a couple of wind-swept islands in the cold North Atlantic while letting go of an entire country? The answer is very interesting. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, the name makes it sound like two islands, but it's actually a small cluster of 8 islands, and only a couple really matter for living on. The first is Saint-Pierre. It's the smaller one, just 26 square kilometers of rugged volcanic rock. But it's got one thing that changed everything: a natural harbor protected from the worst of the sea, facing the sunrise. Without that harbor, nobody would live here at all. And that's exactly where almost everyone does live, packed into a little town that looks like somebody picked it up out of the French countryside and dropped it onto a bare North American rock. Then there's Miquelon, and the geography here is wild. Miquelon is really 3 old islands that the ocean slowly glued together over time. Up north is Grand Miquelon, down south is Langlade, and joining them is a strange 12-kilometer strip of sand called the Dune. Long ago, those 2 islands were separate, split by a stretch of shallow water that sailors dreaded. But bit by bit, the ocean currents dumped sand in the gap until it built a solid land bridge, fusing them into one. That bridge came at a heavy price, though. The waters around it are a graveyard. Back before modern navigation, hundreds of ships got lost in the fog, trying to slip through the gap between the islands, not knowing the gap had already closed up. Drive across that sandy strip today, and you can still spot the ribs of old wrecks poking up out of the sand. It's a hard reminder that the scenery out here might be beautiful, but the sea is not gentle. These islands aren't really separate from Canada at all, geologically speaking. They're basically the long-lost cousins of Newfoundland. Rewind the clock hundreds of millions of years, and this rock wasn't even in North America. It was part of a chunk of land sitting near ancient Africa. Back when the continents were smashing together into one giant supercontinent, this piece got welded onto the edge of North America. And when it all ripped apart again to open up the Atlantic Ocean, this little fragment stayed stuck to the Canadian side instead of drifting off with Europe or Africa. So when you stand on the rock of Saint-Pierre, you're standing on land that traveled thousands of miles across the planet to get where it is. But the real story of these islands isn't the ground, it's the water. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon sit right on the edge of the Grand Banks, a huge stretch of shallow sea where the water is sometimes only 50 to 100 meters deep. And this spot is where 2 giant ocean currents crash into each other. From the north comes the Labrador Current, dragging down freezing cold water and icebergs from the Arctic. From the south rolls in the Gulf Stream, carrying warm water up from the Caribbean. When those 2 monsters collide, 2 big things happen. First, the churning stirs up nutrients from the ocean floor and turns these waters into one of the richest feeding zones on the whole planet. Tiny plankton explode in number, which feeds the small fish, which feeds the cod. And there was so much cod out here, it's hard to picture. That fish is the entire reason Europeans bothered crossing the ocean to this cold corner in the first place. The second thing that collision makes is fog. When the warm, wet air over the Gulf Stream slams into the cold air over the Labrador Current, it turns to fog almost instantly. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon are some of the foggiest places anywhere on Earth, with thick gray soup that can hang around for weeks. The weather out here is rough all around. It's windy, wet, and raw. Fierce North Atlantic gales beat the island so hard they strip the trees bare. The only real forests are on Miquelon and Langlade, scrubby patches of spruce and fir that grow bent and twisted from the constant wind. So gnarled the locals call it crooked wood. There's almost no good soil for farming. There's no oil, no gold, nothing valuable sitting on the surface. By every normal rule of geography, these islands should be empty, just a home for seabirds. And yet there's a real town down there with paved roads, French bakeries, and thousands of European citizens. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to when France ruled a huge piece of this continent. There was a time when French North America wasn't a couple of tiny rocks. It was an enormous empire. At its peak in the early 1700s, New France stretched all the way from the icy shores of Hudson Bay down to the warm swamps of New Orleans. It wrapped around the Great Lakes, ran down the St. Lawrence River, and covered a massive chunk of the middle of the continent. It was a land of fur trappers, priests, and forts, and it was way bigger than the 13 British colonies down the coast. Look at a map today and that whole French Empire is gone. Erased. Well, almost. Because France still holds this one foothold in Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. So, how did France lose a whole continent but keep these two fog-bound rocks? It goes back to the 1500s. While the Spanish were busy hauling gold out of the south, the French found a different kind of treasure up north: cod. The Grand Banks were absolutely stuffed with fish, and in Catholic Europe, where you couldn't eat meat on Fridays or during Lent, cod was almost as good as money. Long before anybody built a permanent town in Quebec or Montreal, French fishermen were already sailing out to Saint-Pierre, drying their catch on the rocks, and hauling it back to Europe. For over 100 years, these islands weren't really a colony. They were a seasonal job. Men would show up in spring, throw up temporary shacks, fish until their hands were raw, salt the catch, and clear out before the winter ice locked them in. But as France put down deeper roots in Quebec and in Acadia, which is now Nova Scotia, these islands turned into something more important. They sat right at the doorway to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, guarding the way into the heart of New France. That made them a target, and for about a century, they never had a steady owner. Between 1690 and 1815, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon changed hands between France and Britain 9 separate times. Every time the two countries went to war back in Europe, which was often, their fleets would sail over here to grab the other side's islands. The pattern was ugly and it repeated over and over. The British would sail in, burn the French settlements to the ground, and ship the people back to France. A few years later, a peace deal would get signed. The French would come back, rebuild their homes, and start fishing again. This cycle of getting wiped out and rebuilding happened so many times that the people who lived here grew a tough, stubborn kind of grit. But the moment that really settled everything came in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War. In North America, they called it the French and Indian War, and it was a catastrophe for France. The British beat them badly all over the world. When it came time to sign the peace deal, the Treaty of Paris, France was made to make a humiliating choice. They could keep their gigantic Canadian territory, or they could keep their tiny sugar islands in the Caribbean, places like Guadeloupe and Martinique. And to the shock of what is now French Canada, France picked the Caribbean. At the time, it actually made cold business sense. Sugar was one of the most profitable things on earth, and Canada was seen as a frozen backwater. A famous French writer of the day sneered that Canada was nothing but a few acres of snow. So France handed all of Canada over to Britain. New France was finished, but France made one specific demand. They needed their fish. They insisted on keeping a foothold near the Gulf of St. Lawrence to support their fishing fleet. And the British, feeling generous after such a big win and wanting to avoid another war, agreed to let France keep 2 tiny, worthless-looking islands, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. There were strings attached, mind you. The British banned the French from fortifying them. No cannons, no walls, no soldiers. They were to be a fishing station and nothing more. So while the French flag came down over Quebec forever, it kept flying over Saint-Pierre. The islands are also tied up with one of the saddest chapters in Canadian history, the story of the Acadians. When the British took over Acadia, they kicked off what became known as the Great Upheaval, forcing thousands of French-speaking people out of their homes. Many of them fled here to Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, France's last little bastion in North America, desperate to stay under the French flag. But peace never lasted long out here. During the American Revolution and later the Napoleonic Wars, the British attacked again. In 1778, they didn't just capture the islands. They flattened the town of Saint-Pierre completely and forced the entire population, nearly 2,000 people, onto ships back to France. The islands sat empty for years, ghost towns lost in the mist. It wasn't until 1816, after Napoleon was finally beaten for good, that things settled down. France's ownership was confirmed once more, and a ship literally named the Revenge arrived carrying families coming home. They stepped back onto the scorched rock of their island, and they've stayed ever since. There's one more strange chapter that nearly cost France the islands in modern times. During World War II, after France fell to Nazi Germany, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon ended up controlled by the Vichy government, the puppet regime that took orders from the Germans. So, right off the coast of Canada, a major Allied country, there was suddenly a patch of land technically loyal to Hitler. It was a nightmare. The Americans and Canadians were nervous that radio transmitters on the islands might be feeding information to German U-boats hunting out on the Grand Banks. So on Christmas Eve of 1941, Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces pulled off a secret little invasion. A submarine and 3 warships slipped into St. Pierre's harbor and seized the government buildings without firing a shot. The locals, who mostly backed the Free French, cheered them in the streets. It was the first territory in all of the Americas to be freed by the Free French. But it set off a huge diplomatic blow-up because technically, European forces weren't supposed to go invading anywhere in the Americas. It nearly triggered an American takeover of the islands, and only some clever politics and the bigger worry of beating Germany kept that from happening. So France held on to its tiny foothold through invasion after invasion. Which brings us to the big question. Why does France still want these islands today? And why do around 5,500 French citizens still live out there? The cod fishery, the whole original reason the colony existed, collapsed in the early 1990s. There's no oil boom. There's no military base. The real answer is pride. For France, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon isn't just a leftover colony. It's a statement. It proves France is still a country with a presence in every ocean on the globe. Giving up these islands would feel like admitting decline, like finally surrendering their North American story for good. So Paris keeps paying, and it pays a lot. The economy out there is basically propped up by money from mainland France. A huge share of the jobs are government jobs. The teachers, the doctors, the police, the office workers, they're all paid on French wages, often with a bonus on top for living overseas. That money flows through the local bakeries, bars, and shops, and it creates a standard of living that's surprisingly comfortable for such a remote rock. But this cozy setup nearly fell apart in the 1990s, and not over money, over a map. Look at a sea map of the region and you'll spot one of the weirdest borders in the world. Late in the 20th century, countries started claiming exclusive economic zones, stretching 200 nautical miles out from their coasts, giving them control over the fishing and minerals in those waters. France looked at Saint-Pierre and Miquelon and said, "We've got islands here, so we claim a 200-mile zone reaching south into the Atlantic." Canada looked at the same map and said, "Absolutely not. Those islands are surrounded by Canadian water. You get a 12-mile circle and that's it." Things got heated. Fishing boats got arrested. Angry letters flew between the two governments. Finally, in 1992, an international court handed down a decision that made nobody happy. They gave France a small 24-mile bubble around the islands, and then, bizarrely, a long, thin strip of water just 10 miles wide, running 200 miles south. On a map, it looks exactly like a keyhole. That keyhole gives France a path out to open ocean without crossing Canadian water, but it cut them off from the best fishing grounds. It was a death blow to their big fishing industry and shoved the islands hard toward what keeps them going now: tourism and French subsidies. Before the subsidy days, though, the islanders had a far more colorful way of making a buck. Visit St. Pierre now, and you'll still hear stories about the Golden Age. That wasn't the fishing era. It was the 1920s and 30s, during American Prohibition. When the United States banned alcohol, St. Pierre turned into the most convenient liquor cabinet on the continent. Giant warehouses went up along the waterfront. Ships from Europe unloaded millions of gallons of whiskey, wine, and champagne onto the docks. Then rum runners would load up fast boats and smuggle the booze down the American coast. Locals even swear that Al Capone himself came by to lock down his supply. Whether the man actually set foot on the rock is up for debate, but the money he threw around was real. For one wild decade, this sleepy fishing village was swimming in gangster cash. Then Prohibition ended, and the party stopped cold. But that smuggler's spirit still lives in the local identity, a tiny place that's always known how to play the rules of the big empires around it. So, what does Canada make of all this today? You might expect friction. Having another country's land sitting 25 kilometers off your coast usually spells trouble. But the relationship is shockingly relaxed, downright friendly even. For Newfoundlanders, Saint-Pierre isn't a threat. It's a fun weekend trip to eat real French food, grab cheap French wine, and dust off some high school French. The border is soft. Canadians don't even need a passport for a short visit most of the time, though it's always the safer bet to bring one. Ferries run back and forth like a bus route. The Islanders come over to St. John, Newfoundland, to shop at Walmart and Costco, and Newfoundlanders head the other way for pastries and perfume. It's a relationship built on friendly curiosity. Canada puts up with the oddity because it's harmless and kind of charming. France keeps the oddity because it's a point of national pride. And so today, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon is home to around 5,500 French citizens, a number that's slowly shrinking as young people move away. They speak French, they use the euro, and they stay because it's simply where they've always been. It's home, and people don't like to leave home. It's a piece of North America that flat out refuses to be North American. It's a leftover of New France that outlived the entire empire that created it, and it's a geological cousin of Newfoundland, sitting quietly off its shore. France gave away a whole country because a frozen north looked worthless next to Caribbean sugar. But it clung to these two foggy rocks because of the fish, and it holds them still because letting go would mean admitting the empire is truly gone. And that, more than anything, is why the French flag still flies over a cold little corner of Canada's doorstep.